In the summer of 1947, America believed it had finally found peace. World War II had ended. Soldiers had returned home. Families were rebuilding their lives. The radio brought music again instead of war news. But in the quiet deserts of New Mexico, something happened that would quietly shake the foundation of truth itself. Roswell is famous today. Almost everyone has heard the name. UFOs, aliens, flying saucers. But what most people don't know is this. Some of the most important files about the Roswell incident were not destroyed, not classified forever, but lost, misplaced, hidden, forgotten on purpose. And for decades, these missing files whispered secrets that the government never wanted Americans to hear. What if the story you were told was only half true? What if the truth disappeared not in flames, but in silence? That night in early July of 1947, rancher William Mack Brazel stood in the open desert, staring at something that made no sense. The storm had passed, thunder had rolled away, but scattered across his land were strange pieces of debris, thin metal that bent but never broke, rubber-like strips with symbols he couldn't read, and fragments lighter than anything he had ever touched. Brazel was not a man who believed in fairy tales. He had lived on that land for years. He knew weather balloons. He knew aircraft wreckage. This was neither. As he picked up one piece, the metal snapped back into shape after he crumpled it in his hand. No scratches, no burns, no explanation. He felt a chill, not from fear, but from confusion. By morning, word reached the Roswell Army Airfield, and within hours, the U.S. military arrived. Welcome to Untold Golden History. Today, we uncover the lost files of the American Roswell Incident, not the version printed in textbooks, but the one buried in silence, fear, and forgotten paperwork. When military trucks rolled onto Brazel's ranch, the tone changed instantly. Soldiers did not joke, they did not explain, they collected debris quickly and ordered silence. Brazel was taken into custody, not arrested, but detained for questioning. Later, he would tell friends that he was warned never to speak about what he saw again. Then came the headline that stunned the nation. On July 8, 1947, the Roswell Army Airfield issued a press release claiming they had recovered a flying disc. A flying disc! Newspapers across America exploded with excitement. Radio hosts speculated wildly. Citizens looked to the skies. For the first time, the U.S. military publicly acknowledged something that did not belong to this world, or at least did not belong to known human technology. But just hours later, the story changed. The military retracted the statement. Suddenly, it was only a weather balloon, a simple mistake, nothing unusual, no mystery, no disc, and America was expected to forget. But forgetting was not so easy, because behind closed doors, something else was happening. Witnesses later described unusual security at the Roswell base. High-ranking officers flew in from Washington. Debris was shipped out under heavy guard. And then, something even more disturbing, official reports began to vanish. Not destroyed, not officially sealed, just gone. Military clerks would later admit that certain logs from early July 1947 were missing. Communication records referencing unusual material had gaps. Some files jumped dates, others ended mid-sentence. It was as if someone had carefully removed the heart of the story and left the shell behind. This is where the lost files were born. Decades later, when researchers requested Roswell documents through the Freedom of Information Act, the responses were incomplete. Thousands of pages arrived, but the most critical hours, the first discoveries, the initial evaluations, were strangely absent.
One investigator described it as reading a book where every important chapter has been torn out. Why would a weather balloon require missing files? As the years passed, more voices came forward. Former military personnel, now old and nearing death, began to speak. Some whispered, some cried, some refused to go on record. One intelligence officer said he remembered handling a report that described materials not manufactured by any known process on Earth. Another claimed he saw photographs that were later removed from archives without explanation. Then there were the emotional testimonies. A nurse stationed near Roswell later told her family that injured beings were brought to a nearby facility. She described small bodies, large eyes, thin limbs. She broke down every time she tried to finish the story. Soon after she was transferred, her letters stopped, and according to her family, her official service records were later lost. Coincidence or pattern? The cruelty of silence is often greater than open violence. These people were not punished with prison, they were punished with erasure. As America rushed into the Cold War, secrecy became normal. Fear became policy. The government learned that controlling information was just as powerful as controlling weapons. And Roswell became the perfect lesson. Instead of admitting uncertainty, officials buried questions. Instead of transparency, they chose confusion. The public was labeled foolish, curious minds were mocked, and yet the mystery refused to die. Every decade brought new revelations and new disappearances. In the 1970s, classified documents hinted at Project Mogul, a secret program involving high-altitude balloons. But even those files were incomplete. Pages referenced attachments that were never included. Technical diagrams mentioned materials that no scientist could replicate at the time. Again, files missing. Again, silence. For many Americans, Roswell stopped being about aliens. It became about trust, about whether a government built on freedom could justify hiding the truth from its people. Parents who grew up during Roswell passed the story to their children. Children grew into adults who asked harder questions, and still, a lost files remained lost. But sometimes, truth does not disappear forever. It waits. In dusty basements, in private collections, in the memories of people who can no longer be threatened. And somewhere between fear and hope, the Roswell files continue to whisper a story far bigger than a crashed object in the desert. A story about innocence stolen, curiosity punished, and a nation forced to choose between comfort and truth. This was only the beginning.
In the weeks after the Roswell incident, the desert returned to silence. Wind erased footprints. Trucks stopped coming. The sky looked normal again. To the outside world, the story was finished. A weather balloon, a misunderstanding, case closed. But inside military offices across the country, something was very wrong. Paperwork did not match. Timelines clashed. Reports referenced meetings that never officially happened. And certain documents that should have existed, could not be found. At first, clerks assumed it was a simple mistake. Files were misplaced all the time. But as days turned into weeks, the pattern became impossible to ignore. Entire folders connected to early July 1947 were missing. Not burned, not shredded, simply removed. One young records officer later recalled the fear he felt when he noticed the gaps. He was told quietly, without eye contact, to stop asking questions. When he asked again, his supervisor warned him that curiosity could end careers. So he stopped. Many did, but not all. In private, some officers kept notes, small handwritten journals, personal letters, things never meant for official archives.
These fragments, scattered across decades, would later become the only proof that the lost files were once real. One memo, discovered years later in a retired colonel's attic, referenced material recovery inconsistent with balloon technology. Another mentioned biological containment protocols, a phrase never used for weather equipment. When historians tried to trace these references back to official records, they hit dead ends. The files had vanished, and so had the people. Several key witnesses from Roswell's early days were transferred suddenly. Some were sent overseas, others left the military entirely. A few died under unclear circumstances, car accidents, sudden illnesses, unexplained heart failures. Each case alone meant nothing. Together, they painted a disturbing picture. This was not just secrecy. This was control. Families paid the price. One widow later said her husband woke up screaming at night after returning from Roswell. He never told her what he saw. He only repeated one sentence again and again. "We weren't supposed to be there." When he tried to speak to a journalist years later, two men visited their home, polite, calm, smiling. After that visit, her husband burned his notes and never spoke again. Silence became survival. America, meanwhile, moved forward. The 1950s brought optimism, television, space dreams, the promise of a better tomorrow. UFO sightings were laughed off as fantasy. But beneath that optimism lived an unspoken fear that maybe the government knew more than it was telling, and that knowledge was too dangerous to share. Then came the Cold War. Secrecy tightened like a noose. Any unexplained event became a national security risk. Roswell was quietly folded into a larger system of classification, buried under layers of red tape and renamed projects. Even mentioning the incident in official channels became risky. And yet, something unexpected happened. The lost files began to haunt the system itself. In internal audits in the 1960s, investigators noticed discrepancies. Budget allocations that did not align with known projects, transportation records for materials that had no official destination, references to special recovery operations that had no corresponding mission reports. When asked, departments blamed one another. No one wanted to touch Roswell. It was easier to pretend the files never existed. But the human cost kept growing. One former Air Force mechanic, now elderly, told his grandson a story he had never shared before. He described loading crates that were sealed tighter than anything he had seen during the war. No labels, no markings. Guards watched every movement. Inside one crate, he said, was something too light for its size. Inside another, something that made a soft sound, like breathing. He was ordered never to speak of it again. For 50 years he obeyed, until the night before he died. This is how truth often survives, not in documents, but in broken memories passed down through fear. Researchers in the 1980s tried again to uncover the truth. Using newly strengthened Freedom of Information laws, they requested everything connected to Roswell. The government responded with thousands of pages. But once again, the most important pieces were missing. Early situation reports, initial scientific evaluations, medical logs, transport manifests, gone. One researcher described the experience as standing in a room full of shadows. The shape of the truth was visible, but never its face. And then there were the photographs. Several witnesses claimed photos were taken at the crash site and at nearby facilities, yet not a single verified original photo from the recovery ever surfaced publicly. Negative logs showed entries with no corresponding images. Film numbers skipped. entire roles unaccounted for. Lost files, lost images, lost people. Still, the official explanation remained unchanged. Weather balloon, Project Mogul, case closed. But the emotional weight of the story refused to fade. For many Americans, Roswell became a symbol, not of aliens, but of betrayal, of a moment when curiosity was crushed by authority, when innocence met cruelty, not through violence, but through lies. Children who loved science learned that asking questions could make you a target. Soldiers learned that obedience mattered more than truth. Families learned that silence could keep them safe, but hollow. And yet, even in darkness, there was a ray of hope. Some files did resurface. In the early 1990s, a former intelligence archivist revealed that microfilm copies of certain documents had been created as backups. He claimed that these copies were stored separately and forgotten when digital systems replaced older archives. When investigators tried to locate them, they were told the microfilm inventory was incomplete. Again. But this time, something felt different. A few pages leaked, blurry, incomplete, but real. They referenced non-terrestrial alloys, unidentified remains, psychological impact on personnel. The government denied their authenticity, but experts noticed something unusual. The language matched classified military writing styles of the 1940s perfectly. Not science fiction, not imagination. Professional, cold, terrifyingly calm. If these pages were fake, they were the best forgeries ever made. And if they were real, then Roswell was not just an incident. It was a turning point. A moment when humanity might have faced something beyond itself and chose fear instead of understanding. As more witnesses aged and died, urgency grew. The lost files were running out of time. Memories faded. Paper decayed. Truth slipped further away with each passing year. But one thing became clear. Someone, somewhere, had worked very hard to make sure the full story of Roswell would never be known. And that kind of effort is never spent on nothing.
As the 20th century moved forward, the Roswell mystery changed shape. It was no longer just a question about a crash in the desert. It became a mirror, reflecting America's deepest fears, ambitions, and moral limits. The missing files were no longer silent. They were screaming through their absence. By the late 1950s, the United States was racing against the Soviet Union for dominance. Nuclear weapons, spy planes, space itself. In this climate, any unknown technology was treated like a weapon or a threat. And Roswell sat at the center of it all. Some researchers began to believe the truth was not extraterrestrial, but still terrifying. They argued that Roswell involved secret U.S. technology, experimental aircraft so advanced that even military personnel were kept in the dark. But this theory quickly collapsed under its own weight. If it was American technology, why the flying disc announcement? Why the missing biological reports? Why the decades of silence? Others proposed a darker idea. What if Roswell was real, but the cover-up was not just about aliens? What if it was about fear of mass panic? Psychologists advising the government in the late 1940s warned that confirmation of non-human intelligence could destabilize society, religion, politics, human identity itself. In a nation already exhausted by war, leaders feared chaos more than dishonesty. So they chose control. And control always demands sacrifice. The innocence of ordinary people was the first casualty. One classified briefing, referenced in later documents, discussed the psychological containment of civilians.
It recommended ridicule as a tool, mockery, dismissal, turning curiosity into shame. This strategy worked frighteningly well. Anyone who spoke about Roswell was labeled crazy, careers ended, reputations were destroyed. Scientists avoided the topic to protect funding. Journalists avoided it to protect credibility. Truth didn't need to be hidden anymore. It was buried under laughter. But behind closed doors, the government never laughed. Deep within classified facilities, engineers studied materials that did not behave like metal. Thin sheets that remembered their shape, structures that resisted heat beyond known limits. These discoveries would later quietly influence modern technology without ever acknowledging their source. Fiber optics, advanced alloys, stealth design, progress without credit. And somewhere along the way, the original files documenting these discoveries disappeared again. Some believed the files were intentionally scattered across agencies to make reconstruction impossible. Others believed they were locked away in private vaults, controlled by people who answered to no one. There was even a rumor, never confirmed, that a group existed solely to guard certain truths forever. No names, no paperwork, only loyalty and silence. Whether real or not, the rumor itself spoke volumes, because people only invent monsters when something feels hidden. As years passed, a painful realization set in for many Americans. If Roswell involved extraterrestrial life, then humanity had failed its first test of cosmic responsibility. Instead of curiosity, there was fear. Instead of unity, secrecy. Instead of hope, denial. And if it didn't involve aliens, if it involved human cruelty, then the truth was just as heartbreaking. Because that meant innocent soldiers, scientists, and families were sacrificed to protect power. Either way, someone paid the price. Flashbacks from witnesses painted a chilling picture. One former guard described standing outside a hangar late at night. Inside, he heard voices arguing, scientists and officers. One voice said, "They're alive." Another responded, "That changes nothing." The guard never saw inside, but he never forgot the sound of fear. Another witness, a young doctor at the time, claimed he was ordered to examine remains that were not human. He said the bodies were fragile, almost childlike. He noticed injuries consistent with a crash, but also signs of neglect. They were not treated like living beings, he later said. They were treated like evidence. He carried that guilt for the rest of his life. Cruel behavior does not always come from hatred. Sometimes it comes from obedience. This is where Roswell stops being a mystery and becomes a warning. When authority demands silence, morality is often the first thing to disappear. In the 1970s, public trust in the government collapsed due to Vietnam and Watergate. For the first time, Americans openly questioned official narratives. Roswell resurfaced not as a joke, but as a symbol. People demanded answers. The government responded with reports, thick, technical, and carefully worded. They explained away inconsistencies. They acknowledged mistakes. But they never acknowledged the missing files. Those files remained ghosts. And ghosts do not rest without reason. As technology advanced, new generations looked back with fresh eyes. Digital analysis revealed erased tape marks in audio recordings. Typewriter font inconsistencies in documents suggested edits made years after original creation. History had been rewritten, slowly, carefully, painfully. Yet, amid all this darkness, a quiet hope survived. Some believed the truth was not hidden forever, but delayed, that humanity in 1947 was not ready, that fear ruled because understanding was too small. And maybe, just maybe, the lost files were meant to be found when we grew wiser, when curiosity no longer threatened power, when compassion outweighed control. A few whistleblowers hinted at this idea. They claimed that disclosure was planned in stages, that Roswell was the first chapter in a story humanity was still learning how to read. But even they admitted something chilling. Not everyone involved agreed with hiding the truth. Some tried to fight back, and they paid dearly. Careers destroyed, mental health shattered, lives shortened by stress and regret. Karma did not arrive quickly, but it arrived quietly. Many of those who enforced silence later admitted they felt empty, haunted, regretful. Some confessed on their deathbeds, hoping forgiveness could still reach them. One former official said through tears, "We thought we were protecting humanity, but we were really protecting ourselves." That realization came too late. The lost files of Roswell were not just paper. They were moments when humanity stood at a crossroads and chose fear. And yet, the story was still unfinished, because mysteries do not survive this long unless they carry something powerful, something that refuses to be forgotten, something waiting to be understood.
By the time the world entered the 21st century, Roswell was no longer just an American mystery. It had become a global question. The internet connected people across borders, and information, once tightly controlled, began to leak through cracks no government could fully seal. Old secrets do not age well, they rot, and Roswell was rotting from the inside. Former officials who had once felt untouchable now lived quiet lives, surrounded by memories they could no longer escape. Some drank, some isolated themselves, others tried to justify the past by repeating the same excuse: "We did what we had to do." But the human mind does not accept lies forever. One by one, emotional breakdowns began to surface. A retired intelligence analyst collapsed during a conference after being asked a simple question: what really happened in 1947? Witnesses said his hands shook, his voice cracked. He left the room without answering and never spoke publicly again. Another former Air Force officer published a memoir, but one chapter was missing, entirely removed. The publisher said it was the author's request. Friends later revealed that chapter dealt with Roswell. The truth was not just hidden, it was painful. Modern researchers approached Roswell differently. Instead of chasing flying saucers, they studied patterns, paper trails, psychological operations, and institutional behavior. What they found was disturbing. The same methods used to suppress Roswell appeared again and again in later incidents. Ridicule campaigns, discrediting witnesses, partial disclosures mixed with denials. It was a system refined over decades. Roswell had been the blueprint, and the lost files were its foundation. In 2001, a small group of independent archivists discovered something strange while digitizing old military indexes. Several document codes referenced Roswell-related materials, but pointed to storage locations that no longer existed. Buildings demolished, warehouses reassigned, entire physical spaces erased. History wasn't just rewritten, it was relocated. Then came the leaks. Not dramatic, not cinematic, just quiet drops of truth. A scanned memo appeared online, then disappeared hours later. It described non-conventional aerospace debris. A blurred photograph showed a material bending unnaturally under pressure. A voice recording, distorted but clear enough, captured an argument between officials about public readiness. Skeptics dismissed them. Believers held on to them. But something else happened. The tone changed. For the first time, government spokespeople stopped laughing. They stopped mocking. They chose careful words instead. "We are reviewing. We are assessing. We cannot rule out." That shift spoke louder than any document.
It meant fear had changed sides. The people who once controlled the story were losing control, and karma began its slow work. Agencies once proud of secrecy faced public distrust. Recruitment dropped, confidence eroded. Young scientists refused to work under classified restrictions that demanded silence over ethics. The very institutions that hid Roswell now suffered from the culture they created. Truth had been delayed, but not denied. Families of witnesses started speaking openly. Children and grandchildren released letters, journals, and recordings long kept hidden out of fear. When combined, these personal accounts formed a powerful emotional mosaic. Not proof of aliens, proof of suffering. One daughter read her father's final letter aloud during an interview. He wrote about carrying guilt for what we did to those who trusted us. He apologized for choosing orders over conscience. He begged future generations to be braver than we were. Millions watched, and they believed, because the pain was real. Flashbacks returned, not just to 1947, but to every moment silence was enforced. People remembered being laughed at, threatened, ignored. Scientists remembered abandoning research. Journalists remembered killing stories. Soldiers remembered following orders they didn't understand. Roswell was no longer a single event. It was a long wound. Yet within that pain, a fragile hope began to grow. A new generation of leaders emerged, less afraid of uncertainty, more open to dialogue. They spoke about transparency not as weakness, but as strength. They acknowledged that humanity might not have all the answers, and that was okay. For the first time, official reports admitted something extraordinary, that the Roswell incident could not be fully explained, that files were missing, that mistakes were made. This was not a confession, but it was a crack, and light always finds cracks. Scientists revisited old evidence using modern tools. Materials once dismissed were analyzed again. Results showed properties that still challenged explanation. Not impossible, but unusual, advanced, ahead of their time. Whether alien or human, the implication was the same. Something extraordinary happened, and humanity was not ready. But maybe now it was. The cruelty of the past began to transform into a lesson. The innocence that was once punished became the fuel for change. Curiosity returned, not reckless, but thoughtful, emotional, but disciplined. Roswell stopped being about fear of the unknown. It became about responsibility towards it. The lost files remained lost, but their shadow shaped the future. Governments learned that secrecy creates monsters, that silence breeds mistrust, that truth, even when painful, heals faster than lies. And for the individuals who carried the burden for decades, something unexpected happened. Forgiveness. Not from institutions, from people. Viewers wrote letters. Survivors were thanked for their courage. Families felt heard for the first time. The weight lifted. Not completely, but enough to breathe. Karma does not always punish. Sometimes it releases. The Roswell story, once ridiculed, now stood as a reminder that humanity's greatest struggle is not against the unknown, but against its own fear. And the final realization slowly settled in. Whatever crashed in that desert, whatever truth vanished with the files, it did not disappear without purpose. It stayed with us, challenging us, waiting for us to grow.
As the pressure for answers grew louder, something unprecedented happened. Not a press conference, not a dramatic revelation, but something far more powerful. Listening. For the first time, official committees invited not just scientists and military experts, but families, witnesses, archivists, psychologists, people who had lived with silence for decades. The hearings were quiet, emotional, painful.
There were no flying saucer models on tables, no sensational claims, just human voices trembling under the weight of memory. One man stood and spoke about his father, a radio operator stationed near Roswell in 1947. He described how his father had returned home changed, quieter, distant, afraid of the night sky. He used to love stars, the man said. After Roswell, he couldn't look at them anymore. That sentence broke the room, because fear does not always scream. Sometimes it whispers for a lifetime. Investigators began reconstructing Roswell, not from missing files, but from lived experience. They mapped timelines using letters, receipts, travel orders, and oral histories. Slowly, a clearer picture emerged, not complete, but honest. Something unusual had been recovered. It had been treated as a threat, and people had suffered because of it. This realization hit the hardest. Not aliens, not technology, but the cost of secrecy. Psychologists testified about the long-term effects of enforced silence: anxiety, depression, nightmares, broken families. The government had unknowingly created a generation of invisible victims. Collateral damage. The moral question could no longer be avoided. Was hiding the truth worth the pain it caused? Some officials defended the past. They spoke of Cold War fear, limited understanding, and responsibility to prevent panic. Others, younger and visibly conflicted, admitted that fear had driven decisions more than wisdom. A line had been crossed, and crossing it had consequences. As investigations continued, a final attempt was made to locate the lost files. Advanced archival algorithms scanned millions of records. Artificial intelligence traced document references, cross-linked codes, and followed trails humans had missed. The result was both hopeful and devastating. The files were real, and they were intentionally fragmented. No single vault held them. Pieces had been scattered across departments, eras, and formats: paper, microfilm, magnetic tape, ensuring that no future generation could easily reconstruct the whole truth. It was the perfect disappearance, designed not to destroy evidence, but to exhaust curiosity. Yet even this strategy failed, because humanity adapts. What technology could not recover, empathy could. As testimonies spread, public understanding shifted. Roswell was no longer about proving extraterrestrial life. It was about acknowledging historical trauma. People stopped asking, "Are aliens real?" They started asking, "Why were we lied to?" And that question changed everything. Former officials began reaching out privately, offering context, if not confession. Some admitted regret. Some admitted fear. A few admitted they believed the truth should finally come out, even if incomplete. One letter stood out. Written by a man who had helped authorize the early cover-up, it read, "We thought truth was dangerous. We were wrong. Fear was." That sentence became a turning point. It was shared widely, quoted in documentaries, etched into public memory. The emotional climax came not with revelation, but with realization. Humanity's first encounter with the unknown, whatever it truly was, had failed not because of aliens, but because of us. We chose power over humility, control over compassion, silence over trust. And yet within that failure lived a second chance, the chance to do better next time, the chance to face the unknown together. As the final investigation report was released, it did not claim certainty. It did not confirm aliens. It did not deny them either. Instead, it acknowledged three truths. First, an unidentified object crashed near Roswell in 1947. Second, key files related to the incident were lost or deliberately removed. Third, the secrecy surrounding Roswell caused long-term harm to individuals and public trust. It was not the answer everyone wanted, but it was the truth that history deserved. The public reaction was surprisingly calm. There was no panic, no chaos, just reflection. People realized something profound, that humanity had underestimated itself, that truth, even strange truth, does not destroy society. Lies do. The lost files of Roswell had shaped generations through absence. Now their absence taught a lesson louder than any document ever could. Transparency matters, compassion matters, and fear should never lead. As the story approached its end, one final image remained. The New Mexico desert, quiet again, wind moving across empty land, stars shining without judgment. The same sky that watched humanity's confusion in 1947 now watched its slow awakening. Whatever fell from that sky, metal, mystery, or mirror, it forced humanity to look inward. And that may have been the real encounter all along.
In the years that followed the final report, something unexpected happened. The world did not end. No riots filled the streets, no churches burned, no governments collapsed. The sky did not fall, and the stars did not answer back. Life continued. And in that quiet continuation, humanity learned something it should have known all along. We were ready. The fear that once justified silence had been an illusion, one created by power, not truth. The realization settled slowly but deeply. People were not afraid of the unknown itself. They were afraid of being treated like children, unworthy of honesty. Roswell had not shattered society, it had exposed it. Schools began teaching the incident differently, not as a UFO story, but as a lesson in ethics, a case study in secrecy, authority, and human responsibility. Students debated whether fear could ever excuse lies, whether obedience should outweigh conscience. For the first time, Roswell was no longer myth, it was history. Families of witnesses finally felt closure. Some visited the desert where it all began. They stood quietly, holding photographs of loved ones who carried secrets they never asked for. Many cried, not because the truth was painful, but because it had taken so long. One son placed his father's old military badge into the sand and whispered, "You don't have to carry it anymore." The wind answered by erasing his footprints, as if the land itself understood forgiveness. The people who enforced silence faced their own reckoning, not courts, not prisons, memory. They watched documentaries, read letters, saw faces of those harmed by their decisions, and many finally admitted to themselves that protecting humanity never required cruelty, it required courage. Karma arrived not as punishment, but as awareness. Some spent their final years speaking quietly to researchers, offering context without excuses. Others wrote private apologies that would never be published, but mattered deeply to the families who received them. Truth, even incomplete, healed wounds lies never could. As technology advanced, humanity continued searching the skies, not with panic, but with curiosity. Scientists agreed on one thing: the universe was vast, ancient, and full of mystery. Whether Roswell involved extraterrestrial life or unknown human technology no longer mattered as much as it once did, because the real discovery had already been made. We had learned how not to respond. If contact ever happened again, if humanity ever faced the unknown once more, the Roswell legacy would stand as a warning carved into time. Do not choose fear. Do not choose silence. Choose honesty. Choose compassion. Choose unity. The lost files of Roswell remained partially lost. Some truths may never be recovered. Paper decays. Memories fade. Time moves forward without asking permission. But meaning does not require completeness.
Sometimes absence speaks louder than presence. Roswell taught humanity that truth cannot be owned, hidden, or buried forever. It can be delayed, it can be distorted, but it always finds its way back, through people, through pain, through persistence. The desert still sleeps under the same sky. Stars still burn quietly above New Mexico, indifferent to human fear and human hope. And somewhere between those stars and the ground below, the story of Roswell lives on, not as a mystery of aliens, but as a mirror held up to humanity, a reminder of who we were and who we chose to become. This was not the end of a mystery, it was the beginning of maturity. And perhaps when the universe is finally ready to speak again, humanity will be ready to listen. If this hidden truth moved you, don't just watch, stay with us. Follow and subscribe to Untold Golden History for the stories history tried to erase.